is dominate. And I thought that was a pretty good answer. He said, somebody may say 50 words and somebody else puts in one word, and that one word sends things in a new direction. So that was his response. Go ahead.
I enjoyed the question. Were you able to speak to anybody else there?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
And did they say the same things that you were saying? Or did they have different
I didn't hear anything that contradicted what he said. Sorry, I'll have to get into that habit. The question was, did I talk to other people in the community? And the answer was yes. And I didn't hear anything that contradicted anything Gaviotas said. Wherever we went, he would turn over the description of the process, say the tapping of the pine trees or the making of the rosin in the factory. He would turn that over to another member, and they would give most of the explanation for it, because he viewed them as sort of the special expert, at least for the time being, in that area. Okay? Yeah. Yes, you. Mm-hmm.
What happens if a member of the 200 people, their children or someone becomes disruptive or mentally ill? Like here in the United States, children are getting 54 vaccines by the time they're 6 years old, and there's 25% of the kids are on psychiatric drugs. So has their health in terms of, are they buying into that kind of conventional wisdom?
Okay, the question is, what about members who don't go along, who are disruptive, who cause problems? What about the children that maybe in our society get drugs if they're disruptive, things like that? And does Gaviotas buy into the major medical model of psychiatric health, psychological health? I don't know enough to answer that question, I'm afraid. I asked him what happens excuse me, if someone doesn't pull their share of the work, for example. And he said that the social pressure is so great that they'll kind of be forced out. People will just not make it known that they're not pulling their weight and they're not really valued as a resident. And at least he told me, I of course didn't see this happen, but he told me that such people generally leave. They realize that it's not a very good fit for them. But that's the limit of my understanding. And as far as children, I didn't ask him about that.
So this is going back to an earlier slide about the wealth pyramid. And
Yeah.
I'll preface this by saying I'm playing devil's advocate. This is not my opinion. I was speaking with an economist who said that the pyramid has always looked like that throughout history, so therefore saying it's getting worse doesn't really mean anything. So if the wealthiest have always been the smallest proportion of society, what does it really mean that we gauge our social sustainability by looking at that?
The question has to do with that economic pyramid that I showed at the beginning of the talk, and someone that said human society has always been that way, and therefore do we really need to worry about it if that's kind of a constant in the human condition? I happen to know that Avi was an anthropology major in college because he went to the college where I teach, and I happen to know that he knows better than the person who asked him that question, who made that comment. It is not, in fact, true that humans have always had a wealth pyramid, something like that, because the first phase of human existence on Earth, which covered, oh boy, I'll somewhat make this number up, let me just say 75% of human history on Earth, we lived in small egalitarian societies in which there was no measure of wealth. Consequently, no significant measure of wealth, and there would not be ways of discriminating wealth. Wealth differences really begin with the evolution of the state as a social phenomenon, political phenomenon, and get exacerbated with the invention of money. Because money is has that funny property that you can't have too much of it. If your measure of wealth is potatoes, you can have too many potatoes. You can't eat them, they'll rot. If you don't spend the dollars, they'll be fine, and you can save them for next year. So that would be my answer to that. I would just challenge the premise.
So to go to a little bit more detail, then, if you're looking at the feudal system in the Middle Ages, the king proportionately will have as much as the top 1% we have today compared to the peasants. And so from that state level on, has it actually gotten any worse or different, other than there just happens to be more people overall?
I think the question is whether at the state level has it gotten any worse. My inclination is to refer back to the Gini coefficient, and
what is that?
the Gini coefficient, G-I-N-I, maybe I didn't explain it before, sorry. The Gini coefficient is a measure of wealth distribution in a society. And a high Gini coefficient means it's distributed evenly, and a low one unevenly, or the reverse. Does anybody happen to know? You can look at different societies around the world and see strikingly different Gini coefficients. So I would say that even that isn't true. It's not true that it's always a really skewed distribution of wealth. Scandinavian countries, for example, have much more equitable distribution of wealth than the U.S. And the U.S. is more equitable than Mexico, say. Okay, yes, sir.
Gaviotas said some of the people have been there for 30 years. What do they do if they're disabled or the elderly? How do they take care of them?
Good question. Some of the people have been there for a long time. What happens if they become disabled or too old to really do productive work? I think the answer to that is, the basic answer is that the community takes care of them. They stay there, they live there, the community takes care of them. The more nuanced answer is probably very few people who can't do any work at all, and the community will find work for them to do. Yeah. Yep.
What was he doing before this? What prompted this? And what did he do before this happened?
Question is, what was Paolo Legati doing before Gaviotas? Good question. He went to college. Well, he grew up in Popayan, right. And he took some courses at college but didn't finish. He then got a grant, I think maybe from the UN, to go to the Philippines and study economic development there. And what he saw there was the conventional kind of economic development, and he didn't like it much. And he came back to Columbia and began thinking about alternatives. He says, he's quoted by Ellen Weisman in the book as saying that he grew up, his father and some of his other close relatives were somewhat prominent people in Colombian society, and he grew up hearing dinner table conversations about the world's problems and what needed to be done to fix them. So he was kind of predisposed to be a thinker and hopefully a doer. When he came back from his time in the Philippines, he went to work for the government in their economic development program. And then kind of by chance, he accepted an invitation from his uncle, who was minister of something, I can't remember, maybe minister of public works, to take a tour, an aerial tour of different parts of Colombia with him. And one of the parts they visited was the Llanos. And on his first visit there, he thought, oh, it was the most horrible place in the world he'd ever seen. It was so barren and so impoverished. And on the second visit there, he began to think, gee, it's actually kind of beautiful in its own way. And on his third visit there, he fell in love with it and decided that he needed to find some way to come back to the Llanos. And so for the next several years, he shuttled back and forth between his job and the Llanos, exploring it with friends and associates, until he finally, they all kind of came up with the idea of starting this community there. Yeah, so, yeah.
A couple of short questions. You said it's a pretty stable population, around 200. Many have been there a long time. Is there a turnover, or is it pretty much the same people and their kids?
There's been some the question is the population stable, or has there been turnover? There's been some, yes, it's been stable on average. There has been some turnover, but the words he used were, most of the people here have been here for more than 30 years. Again, I couldn't independently
So following up on that,
confirm that, yeah.
have there been other attempts to create something similar? And also, how much land do they have at their disposal?
Okay, have there been similar attempts to create something similar, and how much land do they have? Oh, I should remember the number on the total
Sounds like a lot.
number of hectares. It seems to me that it's about 12,000 hectares, maybe.
For 200 people, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's a lot of land. Of course, 8,000 hectares is in the Caribbean pine, so that's a big chunk of it. I asked him how many people they could support at Gaviotas, which is related, I think, to your question. And he said, well, we feel that we could probably handle 1,000. And more than that, we might begin to generate more waste than could conveniently be absorbed. The sink capacity would be exceeded. In answer to the question of other communities like it, yes, there are a couple of other, I don't mean this disparagingly at all, copycat communities in the Llanos that other people are starting. Gunther Pauli is the name of one person. He's German, I believe, who came and lived in Gaviotas for a while and then decided he'd like to replicate it and take the model and go elsewhere and do something similar. I haven't visited the community and I'm not really too sure how they're doing. I asked Paolo directly about replicating Gaviotas, and his answer was interesting. He said, it can't be copied. It's unique, and every such experiment is unique. So he said what we can do is not provide a blueprint, but provide inspiration. That's what he saw as Gaviotas' main role, to inspire people to think along similar lines, but come up with a solution that's right for where they are.
I have a hard time getting my head around the idea that you can run an effective business that provides healthy salaries without having roles and functions that are defined.
Sorry, without having what?
Roles, particular functions, or in other words, structure.
There is a kind of role situation there. I maybe overplayed that card a little bit. There is somebody who is temporarily, at least, in charge of the pine plantation. There's somebody who's in charge of the factory facility for manufacturing the photovoltaic cells. There's somebody temporarily in charge of the gardens. But they tend to rotate around. People don't get locked into just one place. So there is a little bit of structure, but in comparison to the typical business, less, seemed to me. Yes, sir.
Thanks for the very enjoyable recap of what I had read this book before.
Oh, you'd read it, great.
10, 20 years ago.
Uh-huh.
I think there are businesses in this town that are run without that hierarchy of structure.
We visited with the gentleman who runs the Sky Company.
Right.
As one example.
And I think Gore-Tex is like that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And why is this community doesn't grow elsewhere? It seems to me part of the reason is that it's fairly unrestricted by government. You said that one thing about what operation they could have. I forget, I didn't catch what it was, but
The hospital.
yeah, and because when you introduced Adam Smith, you introduced him as if Adam Smith has been dominating our culture, our political culture for since he wrote, and obviously it hasn't, because he was basically a libertarian, and the government is anti-libertarian, and it's been messing around with the free choices, including choices that would influence what I would say is the basis of environmentalism, and that's private property, not an abstraction of the environment. You know, I would say that the environment is an excuse to not let people manage their own business, including defending the environment that they live in. You know, but in any case, my question is, why wouldn't this duplicate around the world? Because it is duplicated. It's a sky factory, right? You know,
just unknowingly.
But this one is an enjoyable success and creativity of the people of Columbia. So it's very nice.
Yes, it's a very interesting story, just as a story. I mentioned Paul Hawkins's comment that if it can be done here, it can be done anywhere. I asked Lugatti about that. I said, do you think it could be done anywhere? Could it be done in a rich country? And his first answer was, no, I don't think it could be done in our way of doing it. I don't think it could be done in a rich country. The Gaviotas approach is especially suited for a very poor area. Later, he backed away from that a little bit and began to think, well, maybe it could be, but I think ultimately his basic view is that each place develops its own way of, needs to develop its own way of achieving sustainability.
There's a lot of, I mean, when you said that it was, whether it could be duplicated, and then he said, well, it can't be duplicated, but I think it's just, people can do anything, and they can just create out of themselves. It's like that, just like they do with the Sky Factory, Vortex. A lot of the, that they were promoting these things, and this one fellow, Clive Cleveland, who was promoting this kind of stuff, said that the lady from Vortex had to scold the hell out of him because he couldn't get it out of his head, the hierarchical approach,
Right, yeah. I think what Paolo meant when he said that is the Gaviotas, all the details of Gaviotas couldn't be replicated somewhere else. That you'd have to find your own way.
The whole point of my approach to society is that it's completely undefinable. And it's completely a matter of consciousness. It's not a matter of something that some academics and government officials and engineers, social engineers can create. It's just has nothing to do with life, whatever.
I'm inclined to agree with that. Although the government does keep trying to engineer society.
Well, I'm an anarchist. I don't believe in that.
Oh, okay. All right, great.
I've heard that the relationship with inmates. Can you talk a little bit about how they decide about technology? How they make decisions about technology?
Okay, the question is how Gaviotas they make decisions about technology, and specifically about the internet.
I heard that their relationship with the internet has changed over time. They backed away from access to the internet because they felt that having ready-made solutions from all around the world restricting their own local people. That's just something somebody told me.
Okay, I didn't explore that with him. I didn't think to raise that. They certainly have a website, and there's a friends group, maybe it's even called the Friends of Gaviotas, that has a website. So they are a presence on the web, but it may be that they restricted in some ways. They certainly had computers there. I saw them, and they were apparently using them, but they may have been using them for non-internet functions. I just don't know.
Other technology adoption issues?
They don't, unlike the Amish, for example, they don't put up a big wall against technology per se. They look for appropriate technology, certainly, but the Amish will only allow, the default setting for the Amish is no unless we think it can work for us without causing problems. I think the default setting for Gaviotas is probably closer to yes unless we think it would cause problems.
Do they have TV and cell phones, and do they participate in that?
The question is, do they have TV, cell phones, some of the other modern communication devices? Paolo himself has a cell phone. I don't know how much they use cell phones at Gaviotas because I'm not sure how good the communications in that very remote location would be. TVs. You know, I don't know. I didn't see any TVs, but they might.
So I wonder if that helps them be,
If what?
that might help them maintain their community because the desires are not going up.
Mhm. Sure. One of the classic issues in a community is how strong to make the boundary. In Gaviotas, it's not all that strong a boundary. Not nearly as strong as the boundary for the Amish, for example, or the boundary in Old Amana. It was very strong. It was pretty hard to move back and forth. They welcome visitors at certain times of the year. They welcome exchanges of various kinds. They have their facility in Bogota, and several of the members go back and forth to that for various purposes. So I think my impression was that the boundary wasn't especially strong. In a way, that would go against their general disinclination toward rules,
Right.
because the boundary is a kind of a rule. Okay, sorry.
This is lovely for these people, but I keep thinking, obviously it can't be the same kind of community. I would like to know your thoughts, if it's appropriate in this setting, how these kinds of things are getting implemented or can be implemented in our structure as opposed to anti-structured world.
Okay, the question is my thoughts about how these general ideas and approaches are or can be implemented in a world like ours, dominated more by structure. Well, of course, you can step out of the structure of the wider society. That's possible to do. And it's happening a lot in eco-villages, co-housing movements. They're stepping out of the mainstream structure and creating alternatives. Maybe those are sometimes more structured than Gaviotas seem to me, but the Global Eco-Village Network is expanding. There are more and more eco-villages. The number of intentional communities is increasing. There are lots of ways that I see this happening. People not wanting to be completely part of the mainstream system. And it might be, in some places, in Grinnell, it's happening in more limited ways with something like the Grinnell Area Local Foods Alliance. We're kind of stepping away from mainstream food sources and mainstream agriculture and endorsing alternatives. It's not a whole way of life, it's just about food, although I think it connects with other aspects of life. So my own feeling is that it's happening and we need more of it.
Grassroots, the idea of grassroots.
Yes, yes.
Maybe one or two more questions. John's going to head back to Grinnell tonight. We could probably keep him here all night. So we'll just take one or two more questions.
Let's see, was there anybody who hasn't asked a question yet? Yeah.
Do people come specifically for the jobs? You mentioned the jobs are well paid, or how is it that people kind of gravitate to the community? It's not a community.
It's not a village. Okay. In a couple of different ways. Some people come because from Bogota. For a time, they were bringing street children from Bogota to the schools as part of that education. And in a way, the wealthy people from Bogota who were sending their children to the school were subsidizing those street kids. So they had a whole program for street kids. And I think the word is out still in places like Bogota or Medellin, that there is this place, Gaviotas. As I said, it's very well known in Colombia. People know about it. And so somebody might show up at the door in Bogota to their headquarters there and ask about possibilities of going to Gaviotas. As I said, there has to be a job for you. You can't just show up. The other population that they're drawing from is the surrounding population in the Llanos. Guajibo, I didn't say that, and mestizos, other people who are living there who hear about Gaviotas. Maybe they got free bottled water from Gaviotas, and that gave them the idea, well, let's go see what that's all about. And there might be a job opening in one of the areas, and they can stay. So there is a little bit of turnover, and a couple of feeders, both from the cities and the immediate area.
Last question?
Yeah. Well, one more. Okay.
I was just curious when you said between 500 and 600 and now they're 200. Why did people leave and how did that affect the whole, you know, success? I mean, that's a big change.
Yeah, it's a
Very,
huge.
actually,
Okay.
how
Right.
could they do as much productive work and, you know, and why did they leave?
Okay. They mostly left because of the deteriorating political situation. The FARC guerrillas, other guerrilla groups were slugging it out. One of the places they were slugging it out was the Llanos. They were taking over areas of the Llanos. Some areas became so infiltrated by the FARC that the government wouldn't even go there. And so it began to just seem unsafe, as it did to my father-in-law, leading up to him coming home and saying, we're leaving. We can't stay here, it's not safe. So a lot of people also left Gaviotas at that time. I asked Paulo if they had been bothered by the FARC, and he said, oh yes, the FARC or other groups have come and liberated tractors and taken other things from them. But then he added, but we've never been harmed physically ourselves. The other part of your question was, how did the non-community adapt to the depopulation that they experienced? And that's a good question. I wish you'd been there with me in the interview so I could have thought to ask that. I didn't ask it. A lot of things got scaled back. The school got eliminated, as I said. The clinic got eliminated and converted into the water bottling facility. That required fewer people. So they, I think, adjusted in some ways by retargeting different areas. Excuse me?
You said the school got eliminated, they have no schools for children?
Right, today no school system, homeschooling of the children in the community, and then the apprentice system where the children also go around and study the practical hands-on kinds of tasks. Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for hanging on so